The sun had barely crested the horizon when Clara McKinley stepped onto the creaking porch of her weather-beaten farmhouse. The wood beneath her feet sagged slightly, softened by years of rain, wind, and neglect. Beyond the porch, the land stretched in tired shades of brown and fading green. Fields that once yielded crops now lay half fallow, dotted with stubborn weeds and patches of cracked earth. The old barn leaned like a weary traveler, its roof missing shingles and its doors hanging crooked on rusted hinges. Everything around her spoke of endurance, but also exhaustion. Clara wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders as the morning chill clung to her skin. At 34, she felt much older. Widowhood had carved invisible lines into her face and settled heaviness into her bones. It had been 3 years since her husband, Daniel, died in a farm accident. A tractor malfunction, a rollover, and a rushed funeral that left more questions than answers. In the days that followed, Clara thought grief would be her greatest battle. She was wrong. Survival, she discovered, was far more relentless. She had 2 children, Emma, age 9, and Jacob, age 6, both still asleep in their small attic bedroom. Their innocence and laughter were the only warmth that hadn't faded from the house. Clara worked tirelessly to give them stability, sewing for neighbors, cleaning houses in town, selling pies at the Sunday market, and tending the few animals that remained, a milk goat, 6 chickens, and an ancient hound named Duke. Some days, she managed to put enough food on the table. Other days, she pretended she wasn't hungry so the children wouldn't notice the smaller portions. What she feared most was the debt. The farm wasn't truly hers, not anymore. After Daniel's passing, unpaid bills piled up, and the bank, politely at first, then firmly, reminded her of the mortgage he never finished paying. The land, barely producing enough to feed them, had no real market value without costly repair and labor. She was months behind, and the letters in the mail grew more threatening. She read them alone at night, after the children were asleep, tears soaking into paper she couldn't afford to answer. Though she had lived in the county all her life, Claire often felt invisible. People weren't cruel, just distant. Some pitied her quietly, others avoided the discomfort of her circumstances. A few offered kind words at church, but no real help followed. In town, she kept her head down, wearing dresses mended too many times to count, boots with thinning soles, and that same faded shawl that once belonged to her mother. She carried herself with dignity, but the weariness clung to her like dust. Still, Clara was not the sort to complain. Each day began before dawn and ended long after dark. She cut firewood, mended fences, milked the goat, packed school lunches, and prayed the roof wouldn't leak when it rained again. She kept the children's clothes clean, their hair brushed, their bellies, mostly, full. She taught them to read by candlelight and told them stories about their father when their eyes grew heavy. To them, she was strong. To herself, she was simply trying not to fall apart. On the rare quiet evenings, she would sit on the porch with a cup of weak tea and let her thoughts drift. She remembered the early days with Daniel, the laughter, the plans for expansion, the dreams of turning their modest acreage into something thriving. Back then, she believed the world had room for hope. Now, hope felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. But even in the darkest moments, Clara clung to a fierce, almost stubborn resilience. She didn't know how to give up. Not when Emma's shy smile depended on her. Not when Jacob still slipped his small hand into hers as they walked the dirt path to the mailbox. The world might not see her, but she saw them, and that was enough to rise each morning and face what came. She had no way of knowing that everything was about to change, that a storm, wild and merciless, was gathering at the edge of the horizon, preparing to collide with her quiet, battered world. And with it, a stranger who would alter the course of her life in ways she never imagined. The wind began as a whisper, an uneasy stirring that nudged the treetops and rattled a loose shutter on the side of the house. Clara barely noticed it at first. She was in the kitchen, kneading dough for bread she hoped to sell in town the next day, the sleeves of her faded dress rolled to her elbows and a smudge of flour dusting her cheek. Jacob and Emma sat at the small kitchen table, coloring on scraps of old newspaper with the few broken crayons they had left. It wasn't until Duke, the old hound curled in the corner, lifted his head with a low, uncertain growl that Clara paused. She glanced out the window over the sink. The sky, once a gentle gray of early afternoon, had deepened into a strange, bruised green. Clouds gathered in heavy, swirling layers, churning like something alive. She wiped her hands on a cloth and stepped onto the porch. The air smelled different, charged and metallic, like the moment before lightning split the sky. The trees that lined the fence line bowed and shifted in anxious unison. Far off, over the hills beyond the neighboring pastures, something roared. It wasn't thunder. It was lower, deeper, like the growl of the earth itself. A chill prickled down her spine. She hurried back inside. "Emma, Jacob, put your crayons away. Go get your blankets and come down to the cellar. Now." Emma didn't argue. Jacob hesitated only long enough to glance at the sky before following his sister up the narrow stairs. Clara moved quickly, heart pounding a little faster with each passing second. She pulled the kettle from the stove, snuffed the lamp, and gathered the oil lantern and matches. Duke struggled to his feet, sensing the shift in her energy, and limped toward the back door. The first real gust hit the house then, loud and sudden, rattling every loose board and window pane. Rain began to fall, not in drops but in sheets, slamming against the roof with deafening force. Clara took one last look outside. The sky had darkened so quickly it felt like dusk. The fields beyond the house blurred under the sweep of wind and water. "Come on, boy," she whispered to Duke as she lifted the cellar door in the floorboards of the pantry. The dog descended the wooden steps ahead of her, his nails clicking nervously. She heard Emma calling from below, voice trembling but steady, and Jacob clutching at the quilts. Clara had just latched the cellar door from the inside when the sound hit, an unmistakable, monstrous roar like a freight train barreling across the plains. The ground trembled beneath them, and dust sifted down from the beams above. Jacob whimpered. Clara pulled both children close, one under each arm, and whispered calming words she wasn't sure she believed. The cellar was small, lit only by the flickering lantern she had set on an old crate. Shelves lined the walls, mostly empty except for a few jars of canned peaches, pickled beans, and dusty preserves she'd been saving for winter. The storm raged overhead with terrifying violence. Something heavy crashed outside, maybe the barn doors, maybe the chicken coop. Shingles scraped and tore from the roof like paper. The wind howled through the trees, snapping branches with sharp, splintering cracks. The very air seemed to scream. Emma buried her face against Clara's shoulder. Jacob clutched her shawl so tightly his knuckles turned white. Duke pressed close to Clara's legs, trembling though he made no sound. Minutes passed, or maybe hours, time twisted in the chaos. Clara kept her voice low and steady, reciting bits of scripture and stories from when Daniel was still alive. Anything to keep the children anchored while the world above them tore itself apart. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the roar began to fade. The wind softened from a scream to a moan, then to a ragged breath. Silence didn't come all at once, it crept back slowly, hesitantly, as if afraid the storm might notice. Clara didn't move right away. She waited, listening for some sign the danger had passed. Only when the rain eased into a dull patter and the floorboards above stopped groaning did she finally exhale. She kissed the tops of her children's heads and whispered, "Stay here. I'll be right back." But when she reached for the cellar latch, she froze. Through the faint drip of water and distant rumble of thunder, she heard something unexpected, a thud. Then another. And then a knock. Someone was at her door. The knock was faint at first, barely audible over the soft dripping of rain and the creak of settling timbers. Clara froze with her hand on the cellar latch, unsure if she had imagined it. Then it came again, 3 slow, uneven thumps, as though made by someone exhausted or in pain. She turned to Emma and Jacob, who looked up at her with wide, fearful eyes. "Stay here," she whispered. "Don't move until I come back. Understand?" They both nodded, though Jacob clung to her skirt for a moment before releasing it. Duke started up the steps ahead of her, his tail low but not tucked, ears pricked with interest rather than fear. Clara lifted the latch and eased open the door to the pantry. The dim lantern light from below cast her shadow long across the scuffed wooden floorboards. The house was quiet in that eerie, breath-held way that follows a storm's fury. She could hear the wind still sighing through broken places and rain tinkling down gutters that were no longer whole. The front hall was darker than before, half the windows caked in streaks of mud and debris. She moved cautiously, every sense alert. When she reached the front door, she hesitated with her hand hovering over the handle. What kind of stranger would be out in weather like that? Desperation, injury, or worse came to mind. Another knock, softer now, almost apologetic. She drew a breath, steeling herself, and opened the door just wide enough to see. A man stood on her porch, swaying slightly as though the ground shifted beneath him. His hat was gone, his dark hair plastered to his skull by rain and dirt. His coat was torn at the shoulder, and his left sleeve was stained a deep, alarming red. Mud caked his boots and the hem of his trousers, and one side of his face bore a streak of dried blood from a cut at his temple. For a heartbeat, neither spoke. Then he cleared his throat, voice rough and low. "Ma'am. He seemed to search for the right words. "I was caught out in it. My horse bolted. I saw your light." Clara's instinct was caution, but something in his eyes, steady despite the pain, humble despite his size, made her push the door open a bit wider. "You're hurt," she said quietly. He gave a faint, weary nod. "Come in, then." He stepped over the threshold with visible effort, wincing as he did. Up close, she could see the deep gash along his arm where fabric stuck to skin, still oozing slowly. His boots left watery, muddy prints across the floor, but she said nothing about it. There were more pressing matters. "Sit," she instructed, guiding him toward the wooden chair by the hearth. The fire had long since gone cold, but the space was still the warmest in the house. He lowered himself gratefully, one hand braced on the table, the other pressed lightly to his ribs. She fetched a basin and what clean cloths she had left, then lit a small oil lamp to get a better look at his wounds. "I can take care of it myself," he muttered, though his voice lacked conviction. "You'll bleed all over my floor if you do," she replied, not unkindly. His mouth twitched, maybe the ghost of a smile, but he didn't argue. She worked in silence at first, cleaning the blood and dirt from his arm. He hissed when the cool water touched the raw flesh, but he didn't pull away. His skin was weathered, tanned from years in the sun, and his hands bore the roughness of someone accustomed to labor. "You in town?" she asked at last. "Not exactly," he said, pausing as if weighing how much to reveal. "I was checking some fences north of here when the sky turned. Didn't make it back before it hit." "Fences?" she repeated, glancing at him. "I ranch," he said simply. That made sense, the coat, the boots, the cut of his jaw, the quiet way he carried himself. She bandaged his arm as best she could and offered him the last clean blanket she owned. He accepted it with a low word of thanks, his voice gentler now, almost careful. "You're kind to help a stranger," he said after a moment. She shrugged, avoiding his eyes. Storm like that, leaving a man outside would be a sin. He studied her then, as though trying to read past her steady expression, past the patched dress and tired hands. But he asked no further questions. When he finally leaned back in the chair, his eyes heavy with exhaustion, Clara spoke again. "You can rest here tonight. The storm may come back." He gave another small nod. "I'm obliged." She turned down the lantern and moved quietly back toward the cellar stairs to reassure her children. As she went, she couldn't shake the strange feeling that the storm had brought more than just wind and ruin to her doorstep. It had brought a turning point, though she didn't yet know it. By morning, the world outside looked as though a giant hand had swept across the land and scattered everything in its path. Clara rose before the children, as she always did, but the moment she stepped onto the porch, she stopped short. The barn roof was gone. The chicken coop lay flattened like a crushed box. Trees that had stood for decades were ripped clean out of the ground, their roots exposed like gnarled fingers reaching for something no one could see. The air was sharp with the scent of wet earth, splintered wood, and the aftermath of fear. Inside, the stranger, still wrapped in the blanket she'd given him, stirred as the light spilled through the doorway. His arm was stiff, and his ribs were sore, but his eyes were alert the moment he saw her silhouette in the frame. "Storm spared more than I expected," he said quietly. Clara huffed a weary breath. "Depends what you count." She poured him a tin cup of coffee, thin and bitter, but hot, and set it on the table. He accepted it with a nod. As he took a sip, she noticed his eyes flicker briefly to the floor where Jacob's wooden toy horse lay toppled near a puddle of mud. It was one of the few toys Daniel had carved before he died. Before Clara could speak again, a distant rumble of engines broke the silence. She stepped outside to see two trucks making their way down the long dirt road leading to her property. Dust kicked up behind the tires despite the soggy ground, and sunlight glinted off their windshields. This wasn't the bank. And it certainly wasn't Neighbors, not this early, not after a storm like that. The man followed her to the doorway, standing just behind her shoulder. His posture changed the moment he spotted the vehicles, less wounded traveler, more someone accustomed to command. One of the trucks pulled up near the broken fence line, and three men climbed out, wearing work coats and brimmed hats. They didn't look curious, they looked like they were reporting for duty. Before they even reached the porch, two of them spotted the stranger and stopped short. "Mr. Holt." One called, relief washing over his features. "We've been searching all night. Thought the twister took you clear to Kansas." Clara turned sharply to look at the man beside her. He didn't correct them. He just gave a single nod and stepped forward, the blanket slipping from his shoulders. "I made it far as here," he said. "This woman let me out of the storm." The men exchanged glances heavy with respect, almost reverence. One removed his hat as he looked at Clara. "Ma'am, you don't know what you've done." She narrowed her eyes. "I know I offered shelter to a man half dead on my porch. That's enough." The men chuckled quietly, not unkindly, but with the kind of baffled admiration reserved for someone who had just done something rare without realizing it. The name hung in her head, Mr. Holt. Everyone in the county knew the name Holt, though few had ever met one of them face to face. The Holt family owned thousands of acres across 3 counties, ranches, cattle operations, feed stores, and a handful of businesses in town. They weren't flashy, but they were powerful. Their land bordered hers on 2 sides. She turned slowly to look at him. He was watching her with a quiet steadiness, as though bracing for her reaction. "You own Holt Ranch?" she asked finally. "Most of it," he said. "And a few more places besides." The world tilted, not with fear, but with disbelief. She thought of the barn roof she couldn't afford to fix, the debts she couldn't outrun, the land that had once felt too small and too hopeless to save. And standing in her kitchen all night had been the man who could buy the county twice over. One of the hands stepped forward. "Sir, we brought the truck and a medic. We'll take you home." Holt shook his head. "Not yet." He turned to Clara. "I owe you more than a night under your roof." She opened her mouth, ready to say she wanted nothing from him. But the words wouldn't quite form. Instead, she stood silent as he studied the wreckage of her land with a gaze that missed nothing. The storm had brought him to her door, but what came next would change more than roofs and fences. It would change lives. For a long moment, Clara said nothing. She stood on the porch with her arms crossed tightly, not from cold but from the weight of uncertainty pressing at her chest. Jacob and Emma had crept up behind her, peeking from the doorway with wide eyes. The stranger, Mr. Holt, now no longer nameless, glanced briefly at the children, then at the shattered remains of her barn, the sagging porch beams, the fields littered with debris. The men who had arrived with the trucks waited at a respectful distance, speaking in low voices. One had already begun clearing fallen branches from the path to the road. Another surveyed the damage with a grim kind of familiarity, as if he'd seen this sort of ruin before and knew exactly what it would take to rebuild. Clara's instincts soared with themselves. Gratitude wrestled with pride. She had taken no charity in the 3 hard years since Daniel's death, not from the church, not from the county, not from neighbors who whispered more than they offered. Kindness, she had learned, often came with strings. "You don't owe me anything," she said at last, her voice steady but guarded. Holt didn't argue. He didn't puff up with pride or soften her with easy words. He simply nodded once, as though he expected her to say exactly that. "Maybe so," he said calmly. "But I pay my debts, not in talk, but in action." She met his gaze, searching for mockery or arrogance and finding neither. Instead, she saw a quiet resolve, the kind that comes from a lifetime of responsibility few people ever understood. One of the ranch hands cleared his throat gently. "Sir, the north fields are gone. The fencing near Miller's Creek is wiped out. The barn at East Hollow collapsed. Folks'll be needing direction soon." Holt's jaw tightened for a moment. Then he turned to the men. "Start with the families hit worst. Bring anyone displaced to the bunkhouse until we sort housing. Send word to town that we'll cover supplies. And get a crew out here." The men nodded and moved to their trucks without hesitation, peeling off to carry out his orders as though they were second nature. Clara blinked. "A crew? For what?" He looked at her as though the answer was obvious. "Your barn's half gone. Roof's shot. Porch needs bracing. You've got livestock unaccounted for and trees down across your fence. My men will see to it." She shook her head quickly. "I can't pay for that." "I didn't ask you to." "That's not how this works," she snapped, a flicker of old anger rising. "I'm not looking for rescue." His voice remained calm, almost gentle. "You gave me shelter when you didn't know my name. When there was nothing in it for you. That kind of courage deserves something back." She hesitated. Words tangled in the space between them. From the doorway, Emma tugged at Clara's skirt. "Mama! The roof over our room is leaking." That small, trembling voice shattered the last of Clara's resistance. Her shoulders sagged beneath the invisible weight she had carried too long. Holt glanced at the cabin roof. "My men can have tarps up before sundown." Clara swallowed hard. "And what happens when the work is done? You'll want something signed over? Land? Labor? Favors?" He held her gaze, unwavering. "I don't buy kindness. I repay it. That's the long and short of it." She searched his face again, and for the first time, allowed the possibility that he meant exactly what he said. No pity. No hidden bargain. Just a man honoring a debt of honor. Jacob stepped beside Emma then, clutching the wooden horse Daniel had carved, the same one lying in mud moments ago. The boy looked up at Holt with wide, curious eyes and asked, "Did the storm break your house too?" Holt crouched slightly despite the pain in his ribs. "Some of it. But we'll fix it. Just like we'll fix yours." The children seemed to accept this without question. Clara, however, remained silent for a long moment. Her pride was not gone, but something softer, something long dormant, began to stir beneath it. Finally, she nodded once. "You can help with the roof. And the barn." A pause. "But I'll work alongside your men. This is still my land." He gave a small nod of approval. "Then we'll call it partnership, not charity." As the trucks rumbled back down the road to gather supplies and men, Clara stood on the porch with her children at her side and watched the stranger-turned-benefactor survey the damage with calculating eyes and quiet assurance. The storm had taken much, but it had delivered something unexpected. Not salvation. Not romance. But the first breath of hope she'd allowed herself in years. His fortune might change her life, but not because he imposed it. Because she finally let someone in. And that, perhaps, was the greater miracle.